Our notes tonight summarize the information that is out of the textbook for Chapter 44 about how segregation affected American life after World War II. So segregation was a fact of life in all of post-war America. We get the sense that it primarily existed in the South. And certainly there's reason for that. The South was a very segregated part of the country. But it's important to understand that these different ways that society was segregated do not apply only to the South. That segregation was a fact of life in all of the country. So the book describes 6 different areas of life that were segregated. So we're going to summarize those here. Probably the most noticeable was public spaces. In the court case Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruled that public segregation was fine. It was constitutional so long as spaces were separate but equal. And so the South passed tons of these Jim Crow laws that became the legal basis for segregation. And just about any aspect of public life was segregated in the South. From restrooms to public parks to water fountains to movie theaters to buses and trains, just about everything was segregated. Schools were another area that was segregated. And these segregated schools were certainly anything but equal. Definitely separate, but definitely not equal. Black schools only got a fraction of the money and the supplies that white schools did. They often schools took place in way inferior buildings. What supplies and equipment that they did get might just be hand-me-downs from the white schools. These African American schools were very, very unequal. Housing is another area. In the South, because of the Jim Crow laws, segregated housing was written into the laws. It was called de jure segregation. It was legal segregation. In northern cities, Philadelphia, New York, for example, segregation was informal, but it still existed. It was what was called de facto, in fact. So it wasn't legal, it wasn't written into the laws, but it still existed. Many states, especially in the South, banned marriages between whites and any non-white ethnicity. So that didn't just mean African Americans, but also Asian Americans, Native Americans, for example. The workplace was segregated. Blacks were denied higher paying jobs simply because of the color of their skin. And African Americans were often stuck in lower paying jobs because of a lack of education. Right? It's sort of this vicious cycle where bad schools means not as good education. Not as much education means lower paying jobs, right? And so it's just this cycle of poverty. Also, politics were segregated. Southern states often tried to disenfranchise black voters. That means take away their voting rights. Now, they couldn't do this legally because of the Constitution, but they tried other ways, like the white primary, where only white people could vote for who the party's nominee would be. We discussed things like poll taxes and literacy tests. We discussed gerrymandering, where political parties would draw district lines to try to put limits on the influence of black voters. And despite these very, very visible areas of life that were segregated, throughout the 1940s and 1950s, African Americans start making strides towards equality. There's no real set identified start point for the civil rights movement, but I think most historians would go back and look at the 1940s and say, this is really when strides towards equality start to be noticeable. So some examples that the book discusses. Jackie Robinson broke the color line in professional sports when he became the first black Major League Baseball player. President Truman desegregated the armed forces. That should say forces, not forced, in 1948. Civil rights groups like CORE and the NAACP began to directly fight segregation. NAACP was and still is one of the big groups that fights for African American rights. CORE stood for the Congress of Racial Equality, and that group got a lot of success with a coffee shop sit-in in Chicago that gained national attention. The NAACP tried a different avenue. They went through the courts. They challenged segregation laws in the court system. And one of the biggest successes for the NAACP was Brown versus Board of Education. Okay, Supreme Court case decided in 1954. And this was actually not one case, but a set of 5 cases from different areas around the country that challenged segregated education. After looking at it, the Supreme Court decided that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And what that meant was that Plessy v. Ferguson was overturned. And from that point forward, segregation in schools was outlawed, right? It says separate but equal is not equal. And so because of that, it's unconstitutional. And yet, through the 1950s, even into the 1960s, many states, especially in the South, still tried to resist integrating their schools. And we'll look at some examples of that taking place.